I gather that the topic of the session here is on the alternatives to neoliberalism. And what really is it? It's what Margaret Thatcher said. There is no alternative. But the alternative to what? I think there's no alternative to finance dominating the economy and to shifting the central planning out of government into the hands of the financial centers. So the key is, what do the financial centers want? In the 1960s, I was the balance of payments analyst for Chase Manhattan Bank, and my job was to calculate how much Argentina, Chile, Brazil could borrow. We calculated how much they could export, how much they could earn in foreign exchange, and the idea was their entire economic surplus could be spent on debt service to Chase and other banks. So the answer is the financial planning wants all of the economic surplus to be paid as interest on foreign debt. Now, what happens when this strips an economy and makes it unable to pay? Well, at that point, finance goes into the second stage, and that's the neoliberal stage. And I think it's best to think as finance is the new mode of warfare. The financial sector wants exactly what a military invasion wanted in the past. They want your land, they want your raw materials, they want your gas rights, and they want your public utilities. So this is the foreclosure phase. They want to lend you enough money so that the governments cannot pay. And then when the governments cannot pay, they want you to privatize the public domain, turn it over to the financial sector, and was explained earlier, once you privatize the public utilities, the government not only loses them, it loses the revenue from them. Now, the question is, how does it get countries to go along with this? If you waged a military war, people would fight back. How do you prevent a country from fighting back against the financial warfare that's in them today? Well, the answer, I think you find from biological parasitism. Many people have called finance a parasite for hundreds of years, but it's not simply that the parasite takes the blood and the income from the host. To do that, it takes over the host's brain. The parasite biologically has an enzyme, and it makes the host believe the parasite is part of the body and has to be nurtured, and that's what finance does. The prime center of neoliberal economics is that all debts can be paid, and that paying a foreign debt doesn't cause any problem at all. The original formulator of this was David Ricardo, and his ideas are still being reproduced by the Chicago School. His statement was that any foreign debt is automatically reflected in a demand for exports from the debt-paying country. At the same time he was formulating this, it was called the bullionist position in Britain. Ricardo's had two brothers, and they underwrote Greece's first loan in 1824. When it had achieved its independence from the Ottoman Empire. The loan was issued at a sharp discount. The loan was so heavy that it is just about then as bad as the loan to Greece is now. It was stripping the country. So while Ricardo's theory was saying that all debts can be paid without changing any of society, his brothers were loading Greece down with debt that stripped it and had to be refinanced again and again for 100 years. Now later, the neoclassical economists had yet another theory that all debts can be paid, foreign debts. All you have to do is devalue enough so the price of labor will go down. When a country is devalued, there's a common world price for gas, for raw materials, for capital goods. When you devalue a country, what is reduced is the price of labor. So all of the economic models that are taught in the universities and are applied by the International Monetary Fund are basically an anti-labor theory. The idea that when a country has difficulty paying the debts, labor should be reduced. And they have very complicated mathematics. I'm almost embarrassed to tell you how international trade theory is taught in the schools because it's so silly. I believe you wouldn't believe me. But fortunately, there's an alternative. In the 1830s, in Britain, the anti-bullionists completely disproved Ricardo. And in the 1920s, Keynes argued over the German reparations debate exactly the position that I think Greece should take today. Keynes said that if a creditor demanded money from Germany or other countries, it had to say, how will you pay? Here are the exports from you that we are willing to pay. Europe has not gone to Greece and said, here are the agricultural goods and the other goods that we will take from you. In fact, when Greece joined the European Union, it did not benefit from the common agricultural policy as much as France and Germany and the other countries. In fact, it had to stop producing many of its agricultural goods. And the result was that you could summarize it as do as I say, not as you do. So Keynes had developed an analysis of the capacity to pay. When the German reparations and inter alia debt system broke down, the Bank of International Settlements was created in 1931 explicitly to make calculations of how much a country should pay and to limit the debt service of Germany to that which could be paid without having to sell off its patrimony, without having to part with its capital, and the result was a scale back, and then, of course, the moratorium finally. No similar institution has been proposed today, but what is, and the Bank for International Settlements now is a meeting place for the world central banks, which basically are representing their constituency, the commercial banks, whose philosophy, again, is an anti-labor philosophy, that all you have to do is reduce the price of labor. Now, the alternative to this theory was developed long before Adam Smith. The mercantilists in the 18th century, James Stewart, Hosea Tucker, pointed out that in order to raise labor productivity, you needed wages to rise, and that there was a positive feedback between productivity and wages. They also said when wages go down, there's an emigration, and the population goes down. So already in the 18th century, there was a very clear understanding that paying foreign debt service, at that point mainly to bondholders that held war debts, were going to have to suffer emigration, and they developed basically a theory that rising wages was the way to lower the price of exports and to be competitive. This was a theory that underlay American development after the Civil War. Again, they're saying exactly the opposite to the rest of the countries than what they actually did. So what is needed today is an alternative to the IMF and the BIS in the sense of an alternative economic philosophy. It needs to be an international organization based on the principle that no country should have to pay foreign debt to the point of destroying its economy, reducing its labor force, parting with its basic assets and its national patrimony. This, was pointed out earlier, is a principle of international law. I think that one of the best things that could come out of this conference would be for a development of a kind of strategy that deals with what is the financial and the rentier objective. What is it trying to do in Greece? Much of the left has always talked about, as Lenin said, whom, but they talk about the whom. They talk about the victims. There's been very little analysis of the perpetrators, the financial sector, the rentiers. There's been very little discussion of finance, insurance, and real estate, or rent seeking. The fact is that international lending, much like banks in the United States, do not lend for capital formation. They don't lend to invest in new plant and equipment or for new hiring. Almost all of this is done by retained earnings or by stocks. Banks lend to transfer ownership of property that's in existence. 80% of bank loans in America, and I think in Europe too, are mortgage loans to transfer ownership of real estate. And in terms of the Greek problem now, Greece is being faced with a demand to transfer the ownership of whatever resources it has that can generate an economic surplus to be privatized. Again, the gas rights, the other rights. There has to be a logic developed based on what has already been developed. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. All of these things were discussed in the 1830s to counter Ricardo. They were discussed in the 1920s to counter the hardliners regarding German reparations. And then they sort of fell out of discussion, but they're all there. I've summarized the discussion in my own history of my textbook of trade development and foreign debt. But this is not the philosophy that's followed by the IMF. Even the IMF realized, as James Galbraith said earlier, they realized in 2010 and 11 that Greece's debt couldn't be paid. All of their analysts found this, and yet they went along with the European Central Bank and became part of the bailout loan, and they were very ashamed of it. The European analysts of the IMF quit and blew the whistle and wrote a mea culpa report. Unfortunately, they do this again and again. They made a similar awful loan to Argentina in 2001, and they passed a law saying, a ruling in the IMF, we'll never have another Argentina. They had that in the Greek loan. So Greece is sort of in the same position that Argentina has been. It's been reduced to debt peonage, essentially, by the financial interests. The left has not been prepared to cope with this. And I think largely it's because Marx and other left leaders were optimists. They believed that industrial capitalism was so strong that it would somehow industrialize banking. But instead of industrializing banking, the opposite has occurred. Finance has financialized industry and made industry part of a financial extractive system. So what you're dealing with, I think, now in Greece is the need to put an alternative financial system to an extractive one. For that, you need a real central bank, and that essentially would be your treasury, acting as a central bank. The purpose of a treasury is to run a budget deficit. Budget deficits are what pump money into the economy. Budget deficits are what provide the economy with money. And if there is no budget deficit, then the economy is entirely dependent upon commercial banks. And commercial banks will extract interest, and they don't lend for the same things that government spending is for. They lend, as I said, for the takeover and extractive. So what you need to do is much more than renegotiate the current loan. You need to put in place a treasury-based productive financial system that will finance growth rather than asset stripping.